And Ali's AI. Ali's is a proud Google Cloud partner with specializations in infrastructure, data analytics, cloud migration, and machine learning. They deliver data analytics, machine learning, and infrastructure solutions off the shelf or custom built on GCP using an agile, holistic approach. Now, ladies and gentlemen, during the talk, please ask your questions using Slido, and that way we can get to lots of those questions after the talk. And now let me introduce our next speaker. Julia Bodnar is a lawyer and privacy professional who advises companies on data protection. She works with Pitch, a Berlin-based presentation tool, which she will be using here today. The title of her talk, Understanding the GDPR and Applying Privacy Principles in Your Designs. Please welcome to the stage, Julia Bodnar.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about privacy. And before I jump right into the GDPR and all of your principles and obligations, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you ever have this kind of unsettling feeling that you need to give up too much of your personal data to be using technologies that are useful or even necessary in your lives? I'm looking for nods and heads. Cool. Okay. If you do, you are not alone, so much so that this common experience already has a name. It is called the privacy paradox, and it means that we opt for the use of products and services that we know to be intrusive to our rights because we believe that the benefit that they bring outweigh the risks. It is not that we stop caring about privacy, it just means that we don't really have any other choice. In my case, the most severe example, oh, sorry, it's not moving. Well, that's fun. One second. Are you seeing it? Perfect. Okay. So that's the privacy paradox. In my case, the most severe example of the privacy paradox is that I actually wear this ring. So this ring is an activity tracker, and I use it because it helps me understand and interfere with my fertility. For someone that doesn't want to be taking any hormones, this ring is an absolute life changer. However, at the same time, this ring knows everything about me. It measures my heart rate. It knows where I am. It senses my body temperature, and it can even tell how I breathe. From this, it could infer when I have my period, when, how, and where I sleep, if I drink coffee or alcohol, if I am in a club, if I am sick, or even if I am pregnant. These very private parts of my life are in the hands of a company. Now, oftentimes when we talk about privacy, you hear this argument that, well, I don't care so much about privacy because I personally have nothing to hide. And I think this argument is flawed on many, many levels, but I'm going to name two. For one, I think a lot of people are not aware of just how much they reveal of their lives unknowingly. You don't have to be crazy enough to be wearing a ring or any sort of an activity tracker, which I think a lot of people have, to actually be revealing a lot of information about yourself. Simply by existing on the internet and piecing together your browsing history, your search keywords, your location data, or your online purchases, we can have a pretty intimate portrayal of who you are and what's going on in your life. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, privacy is not just an individual right or need. It is fundamental to protecting those who are more vulnerable in society. And whether that means making sure that lower earners have access to the same information, job advertisements, or financial products as the more fortunate ones, or whether it means protecting women seeking abortions in countries where this is becoming increasingly difficult. As individuals and companies working with data, it is our shared responsibility to make sure that we protect personal data. In Europe, this is not only an ethical choice or a stance or a tagline that you can put on your company, but it is also the law. So the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, came into effect about 4.5 years ago. And it is still the most comprehensive law protecting personal data in the world. Companies within these 4.5 years have pledged one after the other that they are now compliant with the GDPR, and authorities have started giving out really hefty fines when they thought this not to be the case. At the same time, privacy awareness is really growing from individuals, and individuals are also really asking for more. So today I want to help you understand the kinds of principles that you need to think about when you're thinking about personal data to make choices that really honor privacy. So, who does the GDPR apply to? The GDPR applies to all EU businesses, which means it applies to you if you are based in Europe, whether or not you're processing personal data of EU individuals or individuals outside of Europe. Even if your goods and services are directed only towards US people, if you are based in Europe, it's going to apply to you. Similarly, it's also going to apply to you if you are a US company or an outside of EU company directing your goods and services to EU individuals. It also applies, and that's why all of the big tech companies would be captured as well if you are monitoring individuals who are in the EU. So when does the GDPR apply? The GDPR doesn't apply to all data. It applies very specifically to personal data. Personal data is information relating to an identified or identifiable individual. So this means that personal data is information based on which you would be able to single out someone from a group. It can be something as trivial or obvious as a name or an email address, but it can also be something a bit more indirect, where you might need to take a few more leaps to actually get to the person. So sometimes you'll find that companies say that the GDPR doesn't apply or they don't have any personal data obligations in general because they don't process personal data, only to then take a deeper look and see that they have given pseudonymous identifiers to unique individuals. Even if they personally wouldn't be able to single out the individual when they're carrying out their day-to-day work, pseudonymous data is personal data. So personal data is not black and white or purple and white. It is not that one type of data is inherently personal and the other isn't. Although maybe with a name you would probably say it is going to be personal no matter what. But for the most part, it exists on a continuum. And whether or not it relates to an individual is going to depend on the context and perhaps more importantly, the combination. So a time in itself is not going to be personal data. A location in itself isn't going to be personal either. But if you piece these two things together, at a certain time, on a certain location, there's only going to be X amount of people, even if we think about it here. This is our location, and these are the people here. You might be able to single out an individual that has come to this conference, and with that, the time and the location combination might become personal. Similarly, a postal code in itself might not be personal data. Where I live, there's so many people living in that district that the postal code won't reveal anything about me particularly. But if I were to live in a more remote area where there's, say, 5 people in that postal code, the postal code can become personal. So whenever you're thinking about whether or not you're dealing with personal data, you have to think about the broader context and also the other pieces of information that you are going to be treating of the individual. So if you know that you are dealing with personal data, what do you need to do to protect it? Now, there's going to be a really long list of things that you can think of when you're thinking about the GDPR, and obviously I won't be able to go into all of them. But I want to give you a couple of steps on where you can start thinking about personal data whenever you're thinking about implementing changes or new designs. So as a first step, you need to understand why you are processing personal data and what allows you to do that. The why is called the purpose of processing. And it is very important that you think about this before you actually start processing data. With this, the lawmaker wants to avoid companies just hoarding data and then coming up with a plan on what to do with it afterwards. You have to think of the purpose in advance. So if, for example, you are operating some kind of an online store or any kind of online shopping experience, your purpose will likely be that you need to administer data to be able to provide the purchases. You might need billing information for this, shipping information for that, and all of that would fall under your same purpose. You can only recycle that data in limited cases. The GDPR does allow you to recycle it and use it for another purpose, but only if the another purpose is going to be compatible with the first one. So perhaps you would need to keep the data to be able to register any kind of malfunctionings with the product, or you have to also comply with your tax obligations and retain that data. But if you were to use that data for promotion or some kind of a subsequent processing that isn't directly linked to the initial purpose, you might be acting unlawfully. So secondly, so you have your purpose, that's your why, and then you need to think about your legal basis. The GDPR allows you to pick from 6 different legal bases, and you have to, again, think about it in advance. So you might be processing personal data on the basis of consent, on the basis of performing a contract, on the basis of pursuing a legitimate interest, etc. And similarly to purpose, you have to pick one in advance, and you can't switch around from them. So you can't say, I think I have a legitimate interest for this, and if I don't, well, then I've already asked for consent, so it's fine. So you have to make these considerations before you actually start processing. You need to record your processing activities. The GDPR prescribes that if you are undertaking processing activities at scale, or if you are above a certain number in your organization, you need to have a list of the kind of data that you process. In that, you also have to include what the purpose is, what your legal basis is, and where you're going to be transferring data. We'll talk about data transfers later. This record of processing sounds very simple. It's kind of the accounting or bookkeeping of data protection obligations, but for the most part, companies really struggle with putting the list together. That's probably because most of the companies existed already before the GDPR, didn't really care about the GDPR data protection obligations before the fines were so high, and now they try to implement something like this afterwards when data is already all across the organization. So realistically, though, if you want to be complying with your data protection obligations in general, it's going to be very hard if you don't actually have a list or an understanding of what data you hold. So moving back to something very practical to a little bit more of principles. You have to apply data privacy by design and privacy by default to your designs. Privacy by design and privacy by default are both concepts of the GDPR that you should kind of keep in the back of the head whenever you're dealing with personal data. Privacy by design means that you should consider the impact on the rights of individuals already when you are implementing some kind of a change or a new product or feature, or so any time that you're dealing with personal data, privacy should kind of be there. Your baseline of comparison on what you should or should not do with personal data should not be what other companies are already doing wrong or what you've been doing in the past. You should always think of what would be the state-of-the-art way to protect personal data, and you can weigh the cost and the ease of implementation against that. It's not that the law requires you to go out of your way to protect personal data, but it does require you to put reasonable thought into how you can best protect it. Privacy by default is a little bit more straightforward than that, and it just requires you to, so whenever you are dealing with personal data and there's different levels of intrusion possible to the right of the individual, you always have to set the default to the least intrusive mechanism. So if, for instance, you have or are operating some kind of a social media network where you would have different profiles of individuals, the default setting should be that the profile is private. An individual could then go in and change the profile setting to public, whether that would mean public to their friends or public to whoever, whichever groups that they choose. But the publicity about their personal data shouldn't come by surprise, and it should definitely not be the default. You'll find a lot of examples on how this can go wrong and where it's the company's interest to actually be publicizing you before you even know it. That's my favorite one. You have to minimize data. So while you are reviewing what data you process, what your legal basis is, and why you're processing data, it already makes sense to think about data minimization. According to data minimization, you should only ever be processing as much data as is absolutely necessary for the purpose that you're carrying out. So that's why it's really important to define your purpose properly, because this is going to then link to every other obligation that you have. A good example of data minimization is birthday. So it used to be fairly standard for companies who wanted to check whether or not you're over 18 to ask for your birth date. And then perhaps they would use that information to send you some kind of a birthday promo material, or in the worst case scenario, maybe they would even use it to create a better profile on you. If you are thinking about data minimization, you need to ask yourself, how can I get that information, or how can I achieve my purpose with the least amount of data possible? If you are asking, is that person over 18, the likely answer is, you need to ask them, are you over 18, yes or no? And by that, you've minimized the data significantly, and you're not using something that you don't actually need to achieve your written down purpose. You have to delete the data you no longer use, and you have to delete data on request. So there are two different angles on data deletion, and the first one isn't even called data deletion in the GDPR, it's called storage limitation. So based on storage limitation, you should only retain data for as long as it is necessary to fulfill the purpose. Data deletion, on the other hand, the individual right, is a right of an individual to request companies to delete data on them that they no longer need. And this is also called the right to be forgotten. In both cases, deletion means that you should remove information that would relate to the individual. And there was a big debate on whether deletion means erasure or whether it means anonymization. Right now, the guidance is that you can either erase or you can anonymize to the point where re-identification is impossible. Whether that point exists is a different question. It is also important to highlight that in both cases, so both in the case of storage limitation and the individual right to deletion, you need to consider whether there are any overriding interests to keep the data. So the tax obligations are one very prominent kind of example of overriding principles where tax authorities really want you to keep everything that they could need for as long as possible. So when you're reviewing what data you hold and how long you actually need it for your own purpose, you also need to carry out an exercise to think, is there going to be some kind of law that makes me keep the data longer? If there is, you need to separate that data, have a different retention period applied to that, and you can't delete it if someone is asking you to delete it. You have to be transparent on your data processing. So similarly to data deletion, there is going to be a more general obligation to be transparent, and there is one that is going to apply at request. In general, if you process personal data, you need to inform people about this, and typically companies do that by creating a privacy policy. So the GDPR already requires that you comply with this kind of informational transparency obligation in a way that people understand what you're doing. There's different techniques of doing this. You can try to use language that is simple, or you can try to layer your privacy policy. But even if you do an absolute stellar job at creating a privacy policy that people understand, people don't tend to read it. And that's not because they're lazy, it's because reading all of the privacy policies that apply to you within 1 year would take you 25 full days. It's not working days, it's full days. So it's not surprising that you also have an individual right to data access to be able to ask companies more direct questions on what data they hold of you. The data access right means that you can write to a company and ask them what data they hold on you, why they hold that, where they transfer it, and in case they do hold something on you, to give you a copy of it. The companies have 30 days to respond to this, as with all of the other rights all of the other data subject or individual rights. And if they don't do this within 30 days, they at least have to tell you why they're not going to be able to comply with it in 30 days. The only reasonable argument would be that there's so much, or that there is some kind of that there's going to be some kind of a technical need for them to have a bit longer time. You have to understand where and who you transfer data to. So I've already touched upon data transfers being an important element when you're documenting things, but there's a set of very specific obligations around transferring. When you're thinking about the who you're transferring to, the GDPR differentiates between the roles that you can play when you're processing personal data. It knows controllers. Controllers are the ones who are defining the purpose and the means of processing, so the why and the how. That would usually be the business that's collecting the data in the first place. And then there would be processors. The processors are not making decisions around the data. They are just executing the instructions of the controller. So when you're a controller, you are the one that is ultimately responsible for the data processing activity, and you are the one that can be fined if something unlawful happens. So that is why, and also because there's a number of obligations around data processors, you need to understand which companies you are going to send data to, and whether or not they're willing to and able to protect the personal data that you send to them. When it comes to the where of transferring, data transfers, and especially data transfers to the US, are just a compliance minefield these days. Under the GDPR, you have different ways of transferring data outside of the EU, and similarly to the legal basis, you can choose which one of them you're going to apply. What happened, though, in the US is that there used to be an adequacy decision called the Privacy Shield, based on which most companies were sending data to other companies that were then receiving the data there. That privacy shield has been deemed inadequate now, so it's no longer, it doesn't offer sufficient protection of personal data anymore. With that, if you are now sending data to the US, you have to find a different mechanism under which you do it. And there is also an obligation to consider whether the other mechanism is providing sufficient safeguards. And this is really complex, and we also don't have time to go into too much detail. But essentially what you need to think about is if you're transferring data to the US or outside of the EU in general, you need to know what mechanism you're going to be transferring under. And you need to understand what you would do in case an authority would say that this transfer is unlawful. You probably would need to stop transferring, and you might need to look for alternate mechanisms. You have to think about data portability. So individuals have a number of rights. We already talked about the right to access, the right to deletion, and data portability is another one of these rights. Data portability means that an individual has a right to go up to a company and say, I want my data to be transferred to this other company because I'm going to be using their services in the future. But the reason I wrote think about data portability and not comply with it is because it doesn't apply in all circumstances. It applies if the data was given to the company based on the individual's consent or on the performance of a contract. And it only applies to the personal data that was shared directly from the individual to the company. It doesn't apply to information that was derived from that. So in the case of my funky ring, the raw data about my metrics would apply. I would be able to say, I'm going to port this to some other company. But the user profile that they create of me, or the insights that they had created of me, wouldn't apply anymore. So there, your right to portability has its limits. If the information collected includes information about others, so if, for instance, you have some kind of a message operating system and the personal data would include the information of who you sent the messages to, you would need to consider as an organization, can I comply with the data portability without having an impact on the other individuals that are also included in that data? And lastly, when you're thinking about data portability, you need to make sure that it can be securely exported and that it can come in and that you can place it into a commonly readable format. It is not your obligation as a company to make sure that your competitors can read that information. But here again, you have to go into reasonable efforts to try to come up with a format that they might be able to work with. And what happens when things go wrong? So you have to report data breaches within 72 hours. Even if you comply with every single privacy obligation and if you have great security practices in place, you sometimes have data breaches, most typically because of human error. A data breach is an accidental or unlawful disclosure or loss of data. I'm paraphrasing, it's a bit longer than that, but that's the essence. Not every data breach needs to be reported. It only needs to be reported if it's going to have a risk on the individuals. But authorities tend to understand this quite broadly. The 72 hours applies from someone in the business finding out about the data breach. It's if you don't find out about the data breach in the first place, that's a bigger problem than actually reporting a breach. It likely means that you don't have sufficient technical and organizational measures in place to even recognize that a breach happened. An authority might well fine you for that in itself. The 72 hours also means that you have very little time to understand what has happened, but you still want to understand enough about the breach to know whether it needs to be reported in the first place and to be able to give enough context to the authorities to not freak them out because the breach looks bigger on paper than it actually was. So you would want to balance these two interests. You would want to make sure that you're within the 72-hour time frame, but you still understand what you're reporting. So this was a list of things to think about under the GDPR, and then the question is who should be tasked with all of this? Clearly, it's not going to be you. The responsibility is going to be lying with, well, it might be actually. If you're managing a company, if you're in the leadership position in the company, you might actually be the one who is going to be responsible for data protection compliance. But typically, companies like to appoint a data protection officer to actually do the work around this. A data protection officer would be someone that is helping the organization and the people creating systems and designing systems and thinking about data make decisions around what needs to be done under the GDPR. It can be someone internal who understands what the GDPR is and what data protection obligations are, but it can also be an external person. So to recap, We talked about purpose limitation and legal basis. This means that whenever you're going to process personal data, you want to make sure that you know why you're doing that, you have a purpose, and you're limiting the processing to the purpose. You also want to know what allows you to process personal data. That is your legal basis. You need to record your processing activities. This is your record of processing. In the record of processing, you have to understand who you're processing data of, why you're processing that data, where you're storing it, and where you're sending it. You have to think about privacy by design and privacy by default. Privacy by design is that you think about privacy already when you're creating systems, rather than trying to scramble together your obligations afterwards. Privacy by default means that you have to always think, or you have to always set any settings to the least intrusive mechanism possible. You have to think about data minimization and what amount of data you really need to achieve the purpose. If you're collecting more, you're in breach of data minimization, and you really have an obligation to think about how you can reduce the amount of data. You have to think about data retention and deletion. So data retention means that you need to come up with an amount of years or months for which you have to keep the personal data to achieve the purposes. Data deletion means that if someone asks you, you need to delete the data on them. That is unless there is an overriding legal obligation or other obligation that will make you keep it. You should think about transparency, both in your privacy policies and in your general statements towards your customers, but also when someone asks you what data you hold on me. You have to think about where you're transferring data to, both in terms of who that is to and whether they're going to protect data, and which country it is to. You need to think about whether data portability applies, and you need to report data breaches. So, in order to support a healthy democracy and a thriving society, we need to have privacy. And I hope these kind of points helped, oh, picture's missing. I hope these points helped understand what you need to think of when doing so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your talk. Slido is absolutely on fire.
I thought there's not going to be any questions, so
This is the most questions that we've received in the last 2 days, yes.
I hope I get to answer them.
Yes, so the way it works, we're going to answer the top ones, and then when we have time, you pick the last one. So, if a free-form text answer is filled with personal data and is processed as non-personal data, would it count as a GDPR breach?
Possible. I mean, it depends on what, if the company would then be protecting all data as though it were personal data, then it wouldn't be a breach. But if you're not actually going with the obligations that apply to personal data, you're not including it in your privacy policy, you're not complying with the kind of data subject access rights, then it would eventually become a GDPR breach. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of these questions are asking for legal advice here, so.
Oh yeah, disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This is informational only.
Are there differences on how GDPR is enforced? Oh, where'd it go?
It's here. On smaller companies.
There it is, yes. On smaller companies or startups versus big tech firms, is there a difference?
So there isn't a difference when it comes to the GDPR obligations themselves, but the authorities do make a difference. Yes.
So do they take it easier on the smaller firms and startups?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but that's what I see from the fines, that they're not going to be giving out a 20 million euro fine to a tiny company that has, 20 records. They're going to think about it differently. They're going to also assess the risk in a different way. Because obviously if you're not dealing with so much personal data, or if the processing is not that intrusive, then the risk that they would then need to fine for is going to be lower as well.
So in other words, go for it. Yes? All right. I said that, not you.
You said that.
Yeah.
I just nodded.
What happens if after fulfilled deletion request, the company receives new data linked to that person? Should they keep record of who they deleted in the last?
Yeah, that's a fun one. So actually, when you're complying with the data deletion request, you need to be able to prove that you have complied with it. And for that, you need to keep records of the person that you deleted. Kind of backwards. But you're not going to be using that data anymore. So that's going to be perhaps in the hands of the DPO only, and it shouldn't be linked to any other systems. But you're still going to know that this person, perhaps even with an ID, was part of your systems before and you've deleted their data. If a company receives new data, hopefully this wouldn't be matched together because the whole point of the first system would be to just prove that you've complied with your GDPR obligations. So the link shouldn't happen.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Is there a law that specifies the max retention period after the user requests data deletion?
Do you mean in terms of by when you need to comply with the deletion, or?
And there's an example there. If there are backups,
Is there a max retention? So you would need to delete backups as well when you're deleting user data. It's not that when someone asks for the data to be deleted, you need to delete all of the data that you're holding on them. That includes data that you hold in backups.
Okay. I like this rapid fire. How does CCPA in US compare to GDPR? Which one is more constraining?
Well, so that's a really hard question because they're very different. The CCPA is about kind of consumer data protection, and it applies in, I guess, more limit. I guess the GDPR is more constraining in that it's much broader than the CCPA. The CCPA has very specific obligations that kind of make sense in the context of not selling your data and stuff like that. But the GDPR really applies to any data processing, so it's broader. And with being broader, it also means it's going to be constraining.
Great. How does GDPR apply to internal data, for example, on employees?
It applies very much. So it applies. So if you're a business, you not only have to think about your data that you hold on customers or clients or whatever you have, it also applies to your employees. And that's where companies also tend to be a little bit murkier on data protection rights because they think an employee isn't going to care as much, but they do, and you should care about it.
It says how far. So what does... Yeah.
Like how I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong. Is like, does it apply and?
Or is it time based? I'm not sure.
Oh, how far? Oh, well, if it would be the time-based question, then it would apply throughout your employment because you need to have the data of your individuals who you're working with to be able to pay them salaries and I don't know, do whatever. And then afterwards, it would apply based on your tax laws and accounting laws and social security laws. So you would need to hold data on individuals for a while, but that wouldn't include, for instance, your data about their performance. So that you would still need to include in your data retention and actually delete.
Okay. Is there a list of key things to do for new startups? For example, can you recommend a blog that both lawyers and data professionals understand?
I have to think about that. I don't know. There's a lot of resources online when you kind of type in startup data protection. But because the GDPR has become such a big thing and because the fines are so high, there's a lot of professionals who kind of went out there and put out their materials, and I don't know whether they're really thought through or useful. I actually do know. So the ICO, the UK Data Protection Authority, even though they're kind of separate now, but that's still, when the ICO was putting together this material, it was still applying in all of Europe. And they have a very good way of putting down the list of the things that you need to think about when you're thinking about data protection and just kind of tasks and to-dos. So if you just type in ICO, which is Information Commissioner's Officer, then ICO GDPR, and it would bring out the UK GDPR, but for the most part it would apply.
Awesome. Is there a clear limit between non-identifiable and identifiable?
No. It depends on... This one's interesting because it depends on whether there's a likelihood that you could connect information to an individual and how much work it would take you to do that. So a good example of that is IP addresses. As a company that collects IP addresses, you're probably not going to, if you're not connecting it to like other pieces of data on the individual, if you're just thinking about anonymous people and you have IP addresses, you wouldn't be able to identify an individual. But because an authority would be able to identify it, or because a telecom service provider, whoever would be able to identify it, that information is personal, also in your hands. So when you think about whether something is identifiable or non-identifiable, you have to think broadly and check who could help me identify this information. If there is someone that wouldn't be too far out there, so like not the NSA, but like reasonable amounts of actors, then that would mean that it would be identifiable. There isn't a clear black and white, but there's a lot of guidance online from data protection authorities and also the European Data Protection Board. So if you're thinking about it, and if you go into the EDPB, this is the European Data Protection Board guidance on personal data, you might find that the examples that you're looking for, others have already asked as well.
Okay, good. How do you prove that data is deleted or anonymized?
I don't know. So, I mean, an authority would have the right to investigate you and check whether or not they can actually find the data. So the proving would be to allow them to do that and show that it's not there. But I don't know how you can show a record of something not being there, aside making a statement and saying, well, we've deleted it. That's what companies do. They say, we've deleted it. And you have to either trust them, or if you don't trust them, you would go to an authority, and an authority would be able to investigate whether or not they can find it.
Can you ask an entity like a company to delete your whole profile they've created?
Yes, for the most part, you can ask to delete a full profile, but if it would be, for instance, so if there would be some kind of an overriding legal obligation like tax law, if it's, for instance, a profile that you use to make purchases, then they would still have to hold the information, the underlying information, because they would need to prove that you were the one making the purchases, you paid for it, and all of these kind of tax accounting legal obligations. So you can ask them to delete your whole profile, but depending on the context, they might still need to keep some information on you.
Uh-huh. Are the fines large enough to outweigh the cost of maintaining compliance systems?
I think that's the question too. So the fines are 20 million euros or 4% of your annual revenue, whichever is higher. And I don't think anyone's gotten a 20 million euro one, but you get quite high fines. And I think it's not just about the fines. And that's why I didn't even want to start with the fines in my presentation, because I think a lot of times when you hear about privacy, people say the reason you have to comply is because otherwise you're going to get these massive fines. But that's beyond the point. I think the point is people want to have privacy both because it's an individual right and need, and both because it just helps society function better. So it might be that you're going to spend more on privacy than what the fines would be or what the likelihood of a fine is, but you're still going to you're going to be doing something that's simply right. It's a little bit of a moral kind of addition here.
It's a very business-minded question, I think, yes.
Yeah.
So if data
risk-based approach.
If data stored in US-based companies is an issue due to the Privacy Shield, can we still use the US-based cloud environments?
So if you would want to be super, super, super compliant and you wouldn't want it to be up for interpretation, you'd probably want to rather use something in the EU. But no one is doing that because it's just impossible to kind of rework your systems just because the Data Protection Authority or the European Commission has deemed the Privacy Shield invalid. So what people are doing now is they're going, you can read about this on Schrems is the person that challenged these decisions, and he has a privacy organization. It's called None of Your Business, NOYB. And there you can read about the kind of decision and what you can do to compliantly transfer to the US. And they even included a questionnaire that you can send to the companies that you send data to make sure that they're safeguarding data. And whether or not that is going to be sufficient is not really answered by data protection authorities, but there's a likelihood that there's going to be another decision between the EU and the US that will again allow for transfers. So you kind of have to keep your eye out on the news when it comes to US transfers, and in the meantime just understand that it's a murky business.
All right. If someone revokes the consent of personal data usage, do I need to subtract it from historical statistics or throw out previous AI versions that used it?
No, I don't actually. Wait. If you're just revoking your consent to future use, then probably not. But I think when people revoke their consent, they typically also ask for their data to be deleted. I need to verify. I need to think about this. So whoever asked this question, you can find me afterwards, and I can give you a specific answer. Because this is already in guidance. I just can't remember it.
And Julia, we have time for one more. So please choose from the list.
Oh, they're all great. I'm just going to go with the top because that's the one I read first. If I feel if a company applies GDPR perfectly, it has an instant disadvantage in the market. Do I agree? And I unfortunately do. I think it's quite the people that are going to set the tones are going to be the big tech companies, and they have a lot more kind of options when it comes to personal data because you consent to it because of the privacy paradox. So whether or not that consent is lawful is a different question, but they have these heaps of information on you and pretty much can do whatever they want. And then small companies are really struggling to kind of make up for that gap. So on the one hand, I think there is a disadvantage. On the other hand, I do see privacy-conscious businesses coming out and really making a stance on privacy, and I really hope that it's going to make up for that, and people are going to choose privacy-conscious products in the future.
On that note, let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you.